Hello, everyone. This week, uh, we're going to look at variables um in research. We'll look at variables in research, and we'll look at different types of variables and why variables are important in research. And so, a variable is anything that we use in research whose quality or quantity varies. Any thing that we use or things we use in research that their quality or quantity varies. We could also describe a variable as a measured characteristic. That's something that's a trait, something that's measurable, a measurable trait or characteristic, um, or an event or attributes that differs across a population. An example of a variable that comes to my mind is height and weight. This is a characteristic of individual. These are characteristics of individuals. Um, we could talk about a person's height in terms of how tall they are, and we could also talk about a person's weight in terms of the body mass index. So in terms of like um, how much they weigh. In research, um, variables are also symbols to which we assign numerals, which is like numbers, or we give certain attributes or values. And so um, we could say, um, like, um, for instance, when we collect certain data, um, let's say demographic data is data that's related to um, the attributes of a person. So, for instance, the gender, uh, the marital status, um, and age, and things like that. Let's say hypothetically that we're looking at something like gender. If we um, look at gender, we could have two categories or several categories of gender. We could say male or female. We could have all the other several categories that you would find now. Um, and when we put that information into um, data software, we could, instead of writing that out, just put numbers, use numbers to represent those attributes. Um, and so a variable could also be a symbol. A variable is also a collection of measurements or observations of the same aspect about related individuals. And these individuals are called either subjects or cases. And so, just like the example that I gave, if we measure the heights of several individuals, we could just use that as a variable. um, so we could gather several of those to form a particular category to say, okay, that's the height of people. And we could also collect the ages of the people and use that to form the ages of the group of people we're looking at. And so remember what I said, which is that a variable is anything that varies. Which is the quality or the quantity of that particular thing we're looking at that tends to vary. And we have different types of variables. We have what we call categorical variables and quantitative variables. Categorical variables are variables that uh, we determine based on categorical groupings. These are not um, determined based on specific quantities that they would have. And so an example could be gender that we're talking about. So the categories that we would have under gender would be male or female. Um, but a quantitative variable is a type of variable in which we have some type of numerical value assigned to it. So an example that will come to mind would be like first, second, or third, uh, where we would have some type of number assigned to it. So an example of a quantitative variable would be like rankings. Uh, Rankings in terms of number first, second, or third that we talked about. Um, and what do variables do in an experiment? Variables assume several roles. They could be independent or dependent variables, or they could be what we call control variables. Sometimes variables could be latent or intervening variables. Uh, the independent variable is a variable in research that's often manipulated, and the dependent variable is the outcome variable that we're looking at. So let's say we're looking at the relationship between, um, let's say, bad supervision and employees turnover. Employees turnover will be our dependent variable, and the independent variable would be um, bad supervision, because that's a variable that's actually manipulated. Uh, we could uh, we could tweak that to provide several categories of bad leadership. So we could say leadership that's maybe some that will make the subordinates to work at hours that are not appropriate, some that will treat the workers unfairly, and all of that. And then we'll say which of these categories are likely to experience some type of turnover. A control variable is a variable that kind of like impacts the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. That's why we call the control variable. And two types that we have are uh, moderators and mediators. And just like the name says, the moderators, they moderate the relationship between the independent and dependent variable, while the mediators kind of like mediate. So they step in to control the reciprocal influence sort of between the two variables. Um, and so just like I said previously, independent variables are manipulated, controlled at the outset in the experiment. We also call them the antecedent variables. And most independent variables have two or more levels. Um, in a regression, independent variables are also called predictive variables. Uh, the input or the manipulation or the treatment of stimulus variable. This can be active or just an attribute. So active in the sense that the independent variable is something that we could actually see and tends to have a direct influence. Sometimes an independent variable could uh, just be an attribute, just be something that's latent, just like the example that we talked about here. Um, And so active independent variables are those that can be directly and freely manipulated by the experimenter. For instance, if you're doing a weight loss study, you could control um, the diet of the people. Let's say, how does diet impact the weight of a person? Then we could control the diet. Or if we say a specific type of treatment that addresses weight loss, then we could control the dosage or the drug type. And so, active independent variables are the ones that are directly and freely manipulated. Um, and there are several types of active independent variables that we have here, and you can look at those. Attribute independent variables are those that can only be measured. They become like a means that we use to assign persons to groups. And so these attribute independent variables, um, they um, are just they're just some kind of way that we use to assign the people. So for instance, if we wanted to um, create two groups, a treatment and a control group, and wanted to see how we, uh, let's say in the example that we looked at earlier on, which has to do with um, weight loss, we could do that using what we call the attribute variables. Um, Types of attribute variables. There are several types of attribute variables that are mentioned here, but I would not go over them because of my time. But let's go over to dependent variables, which is the variable that's presumed to be under your direct control. The dependent variable, just like I said before, is the outcome variable, and that is because it depends on the independent variable. Um, so let's say hypothetically we're looking at the effects of um, diet and exercise on weight loss. Weight loss is your dependent variable, and that would the dependent variables depend on would a person's weight loss would we're assuming would depend on either their diet or their exercise, the amount of exercise or the type of diet that they take. And so there are several ways that you could discern between um, independent and dependent variables. It is important for you to look at the specific language that is used in a study. When we say like the effect of X on Y, X will become the independent variable and Y will be the dependent variable. If we say the influence of X on Y, so the specific language could be, could mean like we'll say the effects, or we could say the influence, or we could say that Y causes X. So when you see these words like effects, influence, or cause, that gives you some idea that this is talking about um, independent variable, and the other one is talking about dependent variable. Um, Sometimes you would hear like X can be predicted from blah blah blah. That also is telling you that X is the independent variable, and then these other that you see here are the dependent variable. Um, Also, you can look at the title of a study and get an idea of what the independent and dependent variables are. Let's look at some examples right here. Say, first one says the differential effects of two diets on weight loss in middle-aged men. Can you look closely at this and determine what's the independent variable and the dependent variable? So the differential effects of two diets. Um, so we're looking at the two diets here. That's the independent variable. And then weight loss is the dependent variable that we're talking about. Another one says, do computers make it better? Effects of source of vocational evaluation report on students' perception of quality. And so it says effects, just like we talked about here, um, where we talk about the word effect. So when we say effects, whatever comes next after that one, that's the independent variable. So here we say is that the effects of vocational evaluation report on students' perception. So the effects of vocational evaluation, um, that would be your independent variable, and the students' perception of quality would be your dependent variable. There are several examples that you would find on the slides. Make sure that you spend some time to review them to determine which ones are independent and which ones are dependent variable. Another thing that we need to pay attention to is what we call the constitutive and operational definitions of variables. Uh, the definitions that